Hi guys, my name is Sherry. Today I'll be talking about the scientific revolution, particularly the scientific revolution that took place in Europe, but I'll be covering other parts of the world as well. So as always, you guys should follow at Think5able on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. They have really good memes and I think they're really funny. Hi, thank you for coming to my stream. So today it's going to be pretty information heavy, and I'm going to cover a lot about the scientific revolution because it's a really not complex, it's a very eventful time in Europe, and it was on the AP test last year as the DBQ. So we're going to be talking about some background info. What is the scientific revolution and when it happened? Who is involved? Ideas and inventions, the role of women, scientific societies, the influence on Europe, and whether or not you can really call it the scientific revolution. So some context. Oh, does it really? Okay, I'll fix that later. Thank you for letting me know. So we're going to talk about the Catholic Church and their influence on science before the scientific revolution. So they were highly influential in medieval times. That's because church and state were intertwined, and they just had a lot of power as a result. So they played a large role in dictating what could be said and experimented on with science. They believe God created the universe. It's just part of the Bible, you know, like the true creator. And they said that the sun revolves around the earth, and what we call this theory is geocentric. Definitely super important if you need to talk about the scientific revolution and how it changed and how our ideas about science changed. Do you guys know who created the geocentric theory? Like, could you type it in chat for me? Yeah, good job, Ptolemy. He was an Egyptian, and he basically thought that the sun revolved around the earth, and he's the reason why they believe that. Like, he helped support it. Yeah, so that was right. And they believe humans didn't evolve and that we were created in God's image. This isn't particularly important at the moment, but it will be later on with Charles Darwin. So we also have heretics, and heretics are people who go against what the church taught. So yeah, anyone who went against their teachings. And early on, we have Copernicus and Galileo, who are two important people that we associate with the scientific revolution. So definitely remember their names. You don't have to remember the dates, but definitely remember the names. And that's Galileo, and that is Copernicus. So what is the scientific revolution and when did it occur? So what's the scientific revolution? Well, it's a period of scientific discovery that resulted in a bunch of ideas and inventions that we've modified today or still use, like the scientific method we still use. That was created during the scientific revolution, and we've improved upon Galileo's telescope. It also undermined and questioned the authority of the Catholic Church, which we're going to get into today. And it led to the Enlightenment, which I also will be streaming sometime this month. So when is the scientific revolution? Well, yeah, when is the scientific revolution? So it's from 1543 to 1700, but most people categorize it into the 1550s if you want to round up. So it's a nice even number. And it took place all throughout Europe. You can't specify it into one country or one part. And this picture I have is a picture of the heliocentric theory. Very important. So on this slide, I have a bunch of pictures of what seem to be random people, but they've all played a very important part in the scientific revolution. Do you know the names of one of them, maybe? Let me know in chat if you guys can identify any of them, because we're going to go through all of them today and their important contributions to the field of science. No one? Okay, so I'm going to go through them really quick because we're going to go into more depth on the next slide. Yeah, that snazzy dude is Newton. Good job, Jed. So yeah, that's Newton, father of calculus, best math in the world. Makes my head hurt. So on the top left, we have Brahe, however you want to pronounce it. And then we have Descartes. This is Descartes. Bacon, like actually bacon. This is Leeuwenhoek. This Newton, like Jed said. This is Vesalius, and this is Boyle, who was important in chemistry. So some people involved. So this slide talks about the people involved and their contributions to the scientific revolution. And this is going to be the really in-depth slides. So there's a long list of important people that we all consider part of this period of the scientific revolution. And here's some of the great things they did, this whole list. Do you guys think you can match what they did, like the person to the contribution maybe? For some of them, it's more than, for one of them, more than 2 people were involved. Yeah, good job. Kepler's laws of planetary motion. Nice. All right, so I'm going to read off the name of the list of names really quick and try to remember half of them. That'll be a good amount. But especially Galileo and Copernicus and Newton, Descartes, and Bacon. You should definitely know them. And only one of the 3 women down here. So we have Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Brahe, Newton, Descartes, Bacon, Leeuwenhoek, Boyle, Margaret Cavendish, Maria Marian, and Maria Winkelmann. And if it helps, all the women start with M. So I consider Margaret Cavendish to be the most important one of all of them. So in case you want to keep that in your head for the AP test. And for heliocentric theory, we have to thank Copernicus and Galileo for that. They went against church teachings and suffered lots of persecution. Galileo, for example, he also created the telescope, but when he published his findings, the Catholic Church sentenced him to house arrest for the last 9 years of his life and made him take back anything he said supporting Copernicus, because he was the person who validified Copernicus's heliocentric theory, that we revolve around the sun, not the sun revolves around us. Kepler, as Jed said earlier, he created the planetary laws and the laws of planetary motion, basically. So it's not that we travel in a circle, we travel in ellipses, actually. That just helped. That helped also verify the heliocentric theory, because we travel in ellipses around the sun. And then for Vesalius, he studied anatomy of the human body, and he really helped advance science, because before then we didn't know what was inside our bodies. So we knew what was outside because of the Renaissance, like Leonardo da Vinci. He had drawn the Retuvian man, and that's why we know what our bodies look like. But the anatomy of the human body had never really been studied before Vesalius. Newton, calculus, gravity, laws of motion, super famous. Knowing about the laws of motion are considered his greatest contribution to scientific theory, to the scientific revolution. Gravity too, calculus more less so. Descartes, he did deductive reasoning, and Bacon did inductive reasoning and scientific method. Leeuwenhoek, he was responsible for the microscope and finding microorganisms, like not only cells, but like tiny bacteria that we couldn't see with our normal eye. And Boyle found chemistry and the gas law. So you'll probably heard of like Boyle's gas law if you take in chemistry. That's what he did. He really helped advance that field. And then Margaret Cavendish, Maria Merian, and Maria Winkelmann, we will get into on this slide. So we're going to talk about the women in the scientific revolution. You're probably like, who are they? What did they do? Well, I'm here to answer all your wonderful questions. So usually these women came from rich, educated families, and they learned the sciences from the males in the family. Obviously, because they weren't really getting an education where they were going to school, even though they were even lucky to have an education back then. And they generally acted as assistants for the males in a family. Now, they were called assistants because it was sort of a fake position for them so that they can conduct research side by side. And as a result of women and our new advances in the scientific revolution, there was a debate about the nature of women. Do you guys know what that debate was about? No one? Okay, so when we say the nature of women, back then expectations were that women were the caregivers of the house, they were the cooks, they kept it clean. Women are stupid. Women are stupid, they're inferior to men. And then the scientific revolution, despite all this new opportunity for women to be researchers and women to actually go into the sciences and learn new things and find new discoveries about the anatomy of women and men and how they differed, actually played a role in influencing the nature of women. So when we talk about the nature of women, we talk about the debate that occurred. And this debate is, are women caregivers or are they capable of being equals to men? And on one side, during this debate, the side that said they were caregivers and inferior to men actually won out. Do you guys know why they won out? Any guesses? Type in the chat why you think that women were considered inferior to men, even though they were working alongside men. No guesses? Okay, so basically they generally acted as assistants, and what scientists found from the anatomy of women was that our women's hips are wider than men's, which they concluded was a good sign that they were raised to be caregivers, just because they have wider hips to bear children. And also that the skull of a woman was typically smaller than the skull of a man. So they concluded that obviously that small skull meant a small brain, and that made them inferior to men intellectually. So we have physically inferior, as in physically destined to bear children, and physically inferior and mentally inferior because their skulls are so tiny, they have small brains. So this basically reinforced traditional ideals that women are caregivers, and despite what people would think, The scientific revolution was actually pretty bad for women as a result because of this justification of women being inferior. But some women that made a valuable contribution to science were Margaret Cavendish and Mary Winkleman. Yeah, Mary Winkleman. Yeah, they were scientists. They contributed a lot. You don't really hear about them, but it's important to note in general that the scientific revolution didn't do well for them, wasn't very helpful for them, and that they only had this opportunity because they were from rich families. Speaking of working as scientists, we have the rise of scientific societies. So scientific societies. Here are two pictures of the most famous ones. Do you guys know the names of these scientific societies, maybe? Can I get an answer in the chat if you guys know the names? Do you know the one in color or do you know the one in black and white? Okay, well, so I'm going to talk about the one in color first. That scientific society was called the French Academy of Sciences, and obviously, by the name, it was located in France. And then we have the Royal Society of England. Well, obviously in England. Why were these societies? Do you guys know why these societies were so important? Any guess is fine, but can you guys guess why these societies were so important and why I actually thought they were worth mentioning? Yeah, good job, Madonna. All right. So definitely Louis the 16th. No, Louis the 14th was a very important part of it. But really these societies were so important because they helped disseminate or spread new scientific knowledge. They would publish scientific journals, and due to increased literacy rates from the Protestant Reformation, see how history keeps repeating itself and has effects in the future? Due to increased literacy among the people in the revolution, the Protestant Reformation, due to this, the Protestant Reformation, these people, the common people, could actually start reading scientific journals. So it was really interesting because they could read scientific journals, the common people also began to believe. It changed how people conceive the world in Europe. But there's a very important contrast between these two societies. Can anyone tell me what it is? And it's not that one of the pictures is in color and one of the pictures is in black and white. Can you guys guess why it's really? Can you guys guess why? Guess what this really important difference is? Madonna kind of gave a hint earlier. It does have to do with the monarchy. So if you guys can guess. Nothing? No one? No one has any ideas? All right. So the main difference between these scientific societies is that for the French Academy of Sciences, it was sponsored by the monarchy. Louis XIV actually had it created to advance scientific progress in France. And he was directed to do this by his Minister of Finance, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, really important guy for France before the revolution, who actually helped save their economy, but that's for another day. But basically, he sponsored scientific discovery and he actually encouraged it. While in England, the monarchy didn't support it so much. And the Royal Society of England was actually, well, it was not supported by the monarchy. So the members had to do it by themselves. Like, they weren't paid salaries, while in the French Academy of Sciences, they were actually paid salaries for finding new discoveries. And that's like the major difference, but some major similarities are that they spread scientific news and discoveries in the form of research papers and journals that the common people could read and therefore gain an interest in science. And regarding membership, it was always rich, educated men. Back then, you would never see a woman inside one of these societies because they just weren't allowed. No, inferior women, small brains, small brain energy, basically. So now I'm going to talk about the scientific revolution's influence on Europe, since this is an AP Euro, video. So first is the Enlightenment, which I will also be streaming later this month if you guys want to come check it out and reserve a spot, which you should totally do that. And then we have the authority of the church, how the citizens of Europe and change their outlook on the earth, and the social divide between classes. So we're going to start with the Enlightenment. And what I wrote in blue is that reasoning is the answer. And this was basically the main mantra of people during the Enlightenment: rationalism, reasoning. And their thinking was, if we can solve questions. So what they got from the scientific revolution was, if we can solve questions about the universe with reason and rationalism and our observations, then we can solve human problems. And these human problems were about government, how people should be run, monarchies, like absolute monarchies, democracy, like basically that. What's wrong with our government and how can we solve it with science and rationalism? Next, we have the authority of the church. And as I said earlier, the authority of the church very clearly diminished. Yeah, so Catholic teachings. Beforehand, in the medieval times, Catholic teachings were all about, you got to read the Bible. The Bible has all you need to know about science. God created us in the creation of Adam. Like, he made the earth, took him 7 days. We didn't evolve. The sun revolves around us because, like, we're the center of the world. And what the scientific revolution proved was, like, that is wrong, and that one's wrong, and that's wrong, and this is definitely wrong. So the thinking for the thinking of Europe about why the authority of the church wasn't valuable anymore was, if the Catholic Church is wrong about the sun, it's wrong about humans, like, what else could it be wrong about? Because what else could the Bible that we've been taught, like in school and in our homes and in our countries and our society, what else could that Bible be wrong about? So their power was severely undermined. And now with our outlook on Earth, like Europe's outlook on Earth, before the scientific revolution, Europe had partially embraced science, but they were still stuck in medieval times a little bit, because as we know from the Renaissance, it was both a rebirth and a continuation of medieval times. But the scientific revolution was the turning point for this. So basically, European people thought that science could explain everything. The world's no longer a mystery. We have solved that. We have solved problems about space, which we've never even gone to. Like, we've never touched the sun, but we know, like, we've never seen the sun rotate, but we now know it revolves around, we now know we revolve around the sun, not the other way around. And again, with the authority of the church being undermined by this period of new discovery, so did Europe's outlook on Earth was no longer like, oh, I wonder why this happened, but I can't do anything about it because I'm not willing to research anything, because if I do, the church will persecute me. That wasn't the case anymore. Instead, it was more like, oh, science can explain all my questions. Maybe if I research, maybe if I observe this, I'll see a pattern and then I can continue researching it further. So basically, the world's no longer a mystery and we can solve questions about the earth with science. And finally, the social divide. And, as with all new advances, power comes in the form of wealth, and those with wealth get to see the new advances faster. So what caused the social divide was the decline of superstition. And even though the common people could finally read read scientific journals and research and all the new discoveries, they weren't educated enough to quite understand what they meant. They could just read it because they're literate, but being literate, like when you read a new word, it doesn't mean you understand what that word means, but you can pronounce it. That's basically what they were doing. So when I say the decline of superstition, I mean the educated classes have increased skepticism about the world, also important for the Enlightenment, hint, hint. But they had increased skepticism about religion, but the common people didn't. Religion was such a essential part of their lives that they couldn't afford to get rid of it, basically. Not yet anyways. But this scientific revolution was definitely the start of increasing secularism and increasing loss of faith in the church, loss of innocence. We can't trust them anymore. Basically skepticism was I can't trust the church. I have to do my own research. Why is the sky blue? And basically, if someone asked why was the sky blue in old times, they would say, oh, because God made it blue. And that's how he wants the world to be. But now they would be like, oh, because the sky reflects the color of the ocean. Yeah. So basically, they would do their own research. The common people couldn't do this, though, because, poor farmers, not a great combination. But the educated people definitely had the resources to do their own discoveries. So yeah, that led to an increasing social divide between rich people who are highly educated and common people who are slightly educated, but definitely didn't have any resources to get out of that poor common people bubble. They weren't aristocrats. And now we're going to talk about whether or not the scientific revolution was really scientific. Do you guys think the scientific revolution was really scientific? Yes or no? Can I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down in the chat? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay. No thoughts? You guys aren't sure? All right. Didn't they call it natural philosophy? What do you mean natural philosophy? Well, there were a few problems with the scientific revolution, so it's definitely a matter of debate about whether or not you can consider it. You can consider it to be a good thing or a bad, actually scientific or not scientific. So I'm going to talk about why people don't consider it very scientific. So we have witch trials. And even though earlier, remember in my previous slide, I said that there was a decline in superstition, but that doesn't mean superstition was gone. In medieval times, witches, cough, cough, witches were not bad. They practiced often. They were usually the medicine people, kind of, because magic. And basically witches practicing open, but it wasn't until that they began getting associated with demons and the devil that people began actively persecuting witches, and it declined. So when I say witch trials, what do you guys think of? Like, what's the most famous witch trials, obviously? Any ideas, guys? What is the most famous witch trial in history? No, Salem. No, it is Salem. Good job, Madonna. So it is Salem. So even though this is an AP Euro stream, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Salem witch trials, which occurred during the Scientific Revolution. So obviously, the Salem witch trials, lots of innocent women died because either they drown you. So you're gonna be, so imagine you're put on the stand for being a witch. They're going to tie you inside a bag and weigh you down with bricks and throw you in a pool. You have two options. You can either drown or you can survive, somehow get out and swim to the surface. Ending number one, you drown. And when the people drowned, so when the witches drowned, the townspeople were like, oh, I guess they weren't a witch. Oops, my bad. Yeah, they didn't really think much of it. And then option two, you somehow survive. Then you're guaranteed to be a witch. So it was either you survive and you have to run away as soon as possible, because now everyone knows you're a witch because you survived the drowning, or you die and they don't think anything of your death other than that it was an unfortunate accident. Oh, so basically this hysteria, it was a hysteria in America, and that hysteria also applied to Europe. And so, as I said before, in medieval times, people associate the witch with the devil. So that's why it got a really bad connotation. And this superstition started prevailing sometime in the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe. And there were a lot of witch trials. And how do I say this? If there's when people are panicked, it sort of spreads, because that's just how we are. Like, if someone panics, you panic, even though you might not know what they're panicking about. But yeah, so there's a bunch of panic, mass hysteria. The more people that got accused of being a witch, the more people were like, oh, maybe I'll be accused of as a witch. So I should point other people out. It was really just a game of trying to keep yourself safe and trying not to be convicted or accused of being a witch, because if you're accused, you basically have no way out. So even though we have all this scientific discovery and this observation and knowing how to all this observation and knowing how to basically be like, oh, this isn't right. Oh, I saw this, so I think this occurs, or this is my theory, so I'm going to test it and see if it works. Even though we had a lot of experiments, like the scientific method, which is what it was created for, there's still a lot of superstition, because you can't prove somebody's a witch. So you just had to base it on intuition, which was a really big problem. And I had a particular question like this on a practice SAQ, hint, hint. So definitely, even though it's considered the scientific revolution, definitely know that not scientific things continue to occur throughout this era of new knowledge. Secondly, no evidence. Scientific, all right. So basically, no evidence. Scientific revolution did not have much science in it. That's what I mean by no evidence. So when we do experiments nowadays, you guys usually have to come up with a hypothesis, predict what's going to happen, and then do a lab, right? Like, you have to test your idea with a procedure. That's not really what happened back then. So because of Descartes and Bacon, Well, Bacon created the scientific method that we use today, right? Hypothesis, predict what's going to happen, procedure, analysis, like procedure, data, analysis, conclusion, your findings. We use that today, and Bacon created that. But even though he created that, he also came up with inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning is you have an observation. So deductive reasoning created by Descartes. And it's important to know the difference, even though inductive and deductive kind of sound the same. Like, I still have a hard time with it. So don't feel bad if you have a hard time with it still. But basically, deductive reasoning is you have an observation and you start accumulating data. And what I mean by data is they didn't run experiments. It's more like they observed very carefully. They were like, oh, I saw this like a while ago, and I keep seeing this pattern. Like, I keep observing this pattern in some kind of natural phenomenon. So then they formed a hypothesis out of that pattern. And then if that hypothesis rings true, then they declare a theory. So that's deductive reasoning. And then inductive reasoning is that you have a hypothesis. Like, you have a theory or hypothesis. And then, deductive reasoning is that you have a theory, and then you have a hypothesis, and then a theory, and then a hypothesis, and then your observations lead to confirmation. So, inductive goes from observations to theories. Deductive goes from theories to confirmation through observation. And this pattern of only observing was pretty natural. Like, we've all heard the story of how Isaac Newton discovered gravity. He sat by an apple tree, saw an apple fall down and hit the ground. He's like, oh, there must be gravity, right? Like, that's basically what I mean by no evidence. They didn't really conduct experiments. They just looked for stuff and they were like, oh, this makes sense with my hypothesis, so it must be correct. That's basically what I mean by no evidence. And then finally, we have a false justification. So false justification, as I mentioned earlier with Margaret Cavendish and Maria Marion and Maria Wilkinson, and Maria Winckelmann. As I said earlier before, they were women who were involved in the scientific revolution, and they played a super important role in it, even though they were usually considered as assistants, because you can't really tell people that a woman helped you with their research. There's this in some AP Euro textbooks, there's a quote by someone who said that they read a male scientist. They read the paper of a female scientist, and they were like, and what they said was that it was so good that you could hardly think it was written by a woman. So again, this is all about the perceptions of women at the time. So perception of women at the time, can you guys give me a rundown of like what I said earlier and what you already know about perceptions of women in Europe up until this point? You guys got this. No ideas? Okay. So just a reminder that the pattern of women in society, in European society, like how they're treated, is very important on the AP test. Personally, I didn't pay much attention to it, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't, because I know that the topics change. So it's very important to know all aspects of history. But basically, I'm going to go over what the general idea of women and their role in society is. So one, we have mothers. The goal of any woman is to bear children for their husband, to keep the family line going. That was their primary role, which is why, there was a lot of birth. There's a lot of birth in the upper classes. Like the wives had a lot of children, which is contrary to today because poor families have more children nowadays. But back then, only the rich families had more children because they had wet nurses. So they didn't have to nurse. So the mothers didn't have to nurse all the time. Instead, the nurses would do that. And so number one, they're caregivers. Number two, they maintain the household. Yeah. They stayed at home, didn't really get jobs until the Industrial Revolution. Unless there was war or it was the Industrial Revolution, they didn't really get jobs until then. Number three, so we have caregivers, their house, they take care of the house. Number three, basically, they're meant to just be ornaments. Like they receive an education, but it'd be much different than the boys. So if you really wanted to learn science, you'd have to learn it from a family member if you were from a rich, educated family. So those were what women were considered. Those were their roles in society back then. And like I said previously, women weren't smart enough. And how did they justify this? Do you guys remember what I said? How they justified women being inferior to men back then? No one? Okay, so if you were thinking about the debate on the nature of women, you'd be right. And this debate on the nature of women is actually a little ridiculous, but basically, I'm going to go over this one more time because this falls into the false justification. So basically, we have women compared to men hip-wise. Men have straighter hips. They're heart-shaped, I believe, while women have oval hips. And the oval hips are wider, so that allows them to give birth easier. So women's role in society, birth giver, household caretaker, confirmed by them having a naturally wider hip. And secondly, they have a smaller skull. So the smaller skull basically, the smaller skull, like, obviously we know that when you put things, like if you have a container, you need volume, and the bigger the container, the bigger the thing you can put inside. So they applied this logic because they didn't know the size of the brain. They applied this logic to women and men. Men on average had larger heads generally, larger skulls. So they believed that the brain that was inside men was much larger than the brain inside women because women's skulls are much smaller and, naturally inferior. So pea brains, women had, well, they didn't think women had pea brains, but they basically thought. They didn't think it, but they basically implied it, yeah. So that was a bad thing because false justification led to the scientific revolution actually being harmful for women because they were actually making progress beforehand, like the Renaissance, with the courtier, and then women only slightly improved because they also sought to improve themselves, individualism, right? So they slightly improved, and then the scientific revolution pushed all that progress backwards. So that was definitely a problem. So I'm going to go back because we have some extra time. You can ask me, but I'm going to go back and elaborate on some of these contributions. Do you guys have any questions? Personally, I think the scientific revolution is very important because it's definitely going to appear in the AP test some way, somehow. I had it last year as a DBQ, which I can talk about because it was released. So please don't cancel my scores, College Board. But it was a DBQ, and it was about how the Catholic Church viewed the advancements of the scientific revolution, particularly Galileo and the heliocentric theory. And if you want me to pull that up, I can pull that up later. But right now, I'm going to expand more on their contributions because I know I went over them really quickly. So first, we're going to talk about the heliocentric theory. And long ago, as I stated earlier in this stream, it was definitely more about the prevailing theory in the world was that the earth, being the wonderful creations of God that we are, the sun revolves around us because we're the center of the universe. We're the most important thing, you know. The earth is the most important thing created by God and all that. And what Copernicus realized was like, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. So he said that actually, Catholic Church, you are incorrect, and that we not the center of the universe, but actually that we revolve around the sun. And obviously we learned this in elementary school, but it was definitely really new back then. And with such an overbearing church with such a powerful and overbearing church, that affected lots of Europe. Like even after the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church held a lot of authority. It was definitely like a blow to the authority of the church, because it says in the Bible that the sun revolves around us. Like, why are you saying otherwise? Do you not believe the Pope, the church, our God? And yeah, so that was definitely a problem. And then Galileo and then Copernicus, you know, he publishes this theory, the heliocentric theory, in 1543, but, you know, which is what I put earlier for the beginning of the scientific revolution, but usually it's rounded up to 1550 if you want a nice even number. So Copernicus publishes his heliocentric theory the year that he dies, okay? And then a couple 50-ish years later, Galileo comes along and he creates a telescope, okay? And his telescope, and he uses the telescope to observe the planets, the stars, the sun, not the sun, but the planets and the stars. And he eventually realizes that, oh, Copernicus was right. Oh my gosh, mind blown. So again, someone else goes against the church, and the Catholic Church isn't happy. Like we know, they like to send the Inquisition. And guess what happened to Galileo? He publishes a book about all his findings on the earth, and the Inquisition comes and takes him to the church to be tried for heresy. And obviously he's found guilty. Like there's physical proof that he said that the sun does not revolve around us. So he's forced to recant or retract all his statements. And what this leads to is obviously Galileo complies. And then he's sentenced to house arrest for the last 9 years of his life. And fun fact, after Galileo died, you think after the heliocentric theory became norm, it'd be accepted, like he'd be exonerated for his crime against the church, right? It took 350 years. So that's like in the 1900s. Yeah. It took that long for Galileo to be forgiven for something that's correct. So Galileo dies, very sad affair. And then we have Kepler who comes along. Kepler actually was before Galileo, but he's important to the heliocentric theory because he said, with his laws of planetary motion, he said that planets revolve in an elliptical orbits. And wait, the church is like, that doesn't make sense because we're a planet, but the sun revolves around us. That's weird. And then, so basically, based off Kepler's laws of planetary motion, The only way for planets to have an elliptical orbit would be if the sun rotated around a fixed point. But well, not the sun, if the Earth rotated around a fixed point. But it can't be the sun, right? Because the sun revolves around us, right? And then that's how Kepler helped prove the heliocentric theory, because planets rotate, Earth is a planet, sun is not a planet. Therefore, the sun must be the fixed point in space that all planets rotate around in an elliptical orbit. And then for Brahe, he basically created this system. You don't really need to know what it is. I think it was called Tychonian system. And what the Tychonian system did was it's just an illustration of what he believed the solar system to look like. And hint, hint, it had the sun as its major point. And it basically inspired the laws of planetary motion. But, if you can tell, all of these are based on observations because they didn't have the technology to go into space back then. So all these are based on observations. A key point reason of why it shouldn't really be considered the scientific revolution, but it is the scientific revolution. Yeah, kind of confusing, I know. So we have Vesalius, and he studied the anatomy of the human body. Oh my. And if you guys remember, this wonderful gentleman is Vesalius. And before I cropped out what he was doing, in case you guys are squeamish, that picture is of him dissecting a hand from a cadaver, obviously, from a cadaver. And you can see the veins and the muscles and the skin. Like, it's just him dissecting the hand and all the veins and the ligaments. So yeah, he definitely helped with the anatomy of the human body. And he's very important for like medical reasons because we finally understand like what happened. I also forgot to add Harvey on here, but William Harvey was a person from England who figured out how the circulation of blood in our bodies works. You probably don't really need to remember that. Don't know what you would use why you would ever use that to support something, but yeah, just know that he discovered circulation in the heart and how it pumps around our body. And then we have Newton, father of calculus, helped advance mathematics, and his most important contributions are discovering gravity and the laws of motion. And like I said earlier, when I was talking about how the scientific revolution isn't really scientific, gravity, he laid down by an apple tree and he was like, oh, look, this apple fell. Why did the apple fall? Why didn't it float up into the sky? Why? I think, yeah. That is how it has gravity. It has gravity. And that's basically how Newton discovered gravity. That's like the very famous tale. And then the laws of motion, like inertia. You probably don't need to know what these are unless you're taking physics. But just remember that he found out about the laws of motion and gravity. Earlier, Galileo had also conducted experiments about gravity. He was one of the few on this very vast list that conducted experiments. But he climbed up the Tower of Pisa. You guys know the Leaning Tower of Italy? And the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And he dropped two spheres of differing masses, one heavier, one lighter. And they both arrived on the ground at the same time. So then he concluded that something is dragging them down at a constant pace. Like no matter what, they will approach the ground at the same pace. So that's gravity, laws of motion, Newton. Definitely remember Newton. And then we have Descartes, deductive reasoning. So like I said, when Descartes said deductive reasoning, his most famous line is, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And this is basically, he was such a skeptic. Remember, skepticism, major trend throughout the scientific revolution. He's such a skeptic that he doesn't even know if he exists. So cogito ergo sum is his justification for him like existing. Super trippy. Weird philosophers. Descartes also helped advance mathematics. If you guys know Descartes' rule of signs. And basically, as I said before, deductive reasoning goes from theory, and then you have a hypothesis, and then you observe. Remember, observe, not experiment. You observe, and then when you're done observing, if you see a pattern, you're like, then it must confirm your theory. That's deductive reasoning. So, and then we have, in contrast to this, we have Bacon. So Bacon is responsible for inductive reasoning and the scientific method. And he basically made the inductive reasoning very popular. He didn't create it, but he made it very popular. And it basically came in the form of the scientific method. So you have observations. And then we want to make a hypothesis. We have observations, and then we see a pattern. And we want to make a pattern, and we want to make a hypothesis about the patterns that we're seeing. So that's inductive reasoning. You have observations, you see a pattern, then you come up with a hypothesis. And if your observations support that hypothesis, then your observation must be right. And then you come up with a theory from that hypothesis. So that's the inductive reasoning part. And the scientific method, we all know, like you have a theory, hypothesis, blah, 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 perform experiments. That's the modern scientific theory. And then Leeuwenhoek. All right. So he was also very, very important for medicine and like biology in general, because he basically created the first microscope and discovered cells, microorganisms, like bacteria and stuff. He discovered that. And then, like I said before, Boyle, very important for chemistry. He went against the old school of thought that the earth is made up of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water. And instead he said that the earth is made of very tiny particles, which we now call atoms. They're made of very tiny particles. And he created the gas law. So if you've taken chemistry, you definitely know Boyle's gas law. And then, like I said before, Margaret Cavendish, Maria Marion, and Maria Winkelmann are women who were very essential. Well, they're very important women for the scientific revolution. So yeah, just know it's best, in my opinion, it's best to remember Margaret Cavendish. She's the most influential. So I'm going to go back over so I'm going to talk about the themes. So what we can take away from all of this. So basically, one prevailing theme of scientific revolution is that, you guys have any ideas? So like I said before, it caused the Enlightenment. Immediately after scientific revolution, the Enlightenment would occur. You've got theism and rationalism and skepticism and secularism and religion goes down, which I will also be talking about later if you guys want to tune in sometime this month when I'm streaming. And then we have the authority of church that went down too. So we see a pattern in Europe over the course of years from medieval times to now. Church authority is going way down. We have the Protestant Reformation. Didn't really reform, but we have the Protestant Reformation. Church authority decreases. Then we have the scientific revolution. Oh, the church is wrong. It decreases even further. And this is just going to be a repeating motif throughout history, basically. And then, yeah. Also, with our outlook on Earth, Europe has more intellectual freedom. Because of the weakened church authority, people can now think for themselves. They have the courage to do so. That's very important about the scientific revolution. To wrap up really quickly, I'm going to talk about the FRQ of last year's AP exam. So for the FRQ for last year's AP exam, we had it was a DBQ, document-based question. So definitely easier than an LEQ in my opinion, because the information is right there for you. But we had a DBQ, and then it was about how the Catholic Church had viewed the progress of the scientific revolution and everything that went against its teachings. So I definitely recommend you guys check it out. What do you guys think the answer is? Like, based off what you've learned in the stream and what you learned in class, how do you think the Catholic Church perceived the scientific revolution and all of the new discoveries that were made? Technically, there are no right and wrong answers here. It's all about supporting your opinion with the facts that they give you. No ideas? You guys don't have any ideas? Okay, so in the DPQ, it mostly talked about Galileo and Copernicus. And Galileo and Copernicus's discoveries about astronomy and how the sun does not revolve around us. That was the main takeaway. So there were like multiple sides. You could have been like, they supported it, they didn't support it, but definitely try to have a complex thesis that you can back up. In my opinion, I had a complex thesis for this one. So finally, to wrap up, I'm going to basically give you guys like what I think you should know for the AP exam. So definitely know events that happened before this, obviously, and their effect on Europe's thinking, like Renaissance encouraged, scientific, like just curiosity in general, because everyone wanted to reach that peak of self-actualization. And then Protestant Reformation, the church authority decreased. So people felt more courageous and more willing to take risks and observe things for themselves. And then we get to the scientific revolution. And so regarding the AP exam, like themes they want you to know, I recommend you guys know Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, if you want. Kind of difficult to use to support your like heliocentric theory, kind of difficult, but planetary laws of motion were definitely an important discovery. So Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Vesalius if you want. He's definitely helpful for later on when I talk about the Enlightenment. Newton, Descartes and Bacon, definitely. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 people. Oh, and Margaret Cavendish. So that's 8 people. You guys can remember 8 people, right? And it doesn't have to have their first names, just their last name. So 8 people. And definitely know about the heliocentric theory that Galileo helped create the telescope, anatomy of the human body, planetary laws of motion, gravity, deductive, and inductive reasoning. Those are what I think you guys should know regarding the good things about the scientific revolution. And then regarding the bad things of the scientific revolution, well, this slide basically says all of it. Women, despite minor advancements made in the Renaissance, they haven't seen any significant progress in their social standing. And the scientific revolution basically just pushed all of their previous progress back, because now they have science to justify the idea that women should only give birth to children and that they are inferior to men physically and mentally. Definitely know the trend of women as Europe comes along. And scientific societies, definitely important to know that they help spread in science and increased interest in science throughout Europe and through the common people. Even though the common people didn't really understand it, they still read it because it's interesting. Shows that the Bible isn't the source of information nowadays, and that humans, like, we now have an understanding of the world, and it would that understanding of the world, for like that the world was left for humans to discover, would eventually lead to deism, which I will cover in the Enlightenment stream. So, yep, these are very important to know. I believe they're important to know. Like, outlook on the earth, we're more skeptical. We don't listen to the church as much. God exists still, even though we don't really trust the church anymore. God still exists. Just, it's important to note that God isn't everything. God isn't the answer to questions you have about the world anymore. Instead, do your own research. That's very important. And also know that the scientific revolution isn't really an accurate moniker. First of all, wasn't a revolution. Second of all, wasn't really scientific. It just created new ideas for people of Europe to use in their lives. And superstition and bad practices still followed. So thank you guys for coming to watch me lecture about the scientific revolution. But I really enjoy this topic, and I think it's really important for the AP test because I want you all to get a 5, obviously. And if you have any questions, you guys can ask them in the chat. For the next 2 to 3 minutes, I'll be answering questions before I get off. So any questions, anyone? Give me a thumbs up if you understand everything I've said and you have no questions, or leave a question if you need help. Thanks, Jed. I'm so glad you understand the scientific revolution. And if you guys aren't in Euro and you're in world history, I hope this helped somewhat. I've never taken world history, even though it's probably the most demanding AP history class. Don't tell a push I said that. Okay, well, if no one has any questions, thank you guys so much for coming to my stream. I really appreciate it. And I hope you tune in tomorrow for me to talk about exploration and when I finally talk about the Enlightenment, because I have been referencing it so much this stream. Thank you guys so much for coming in and tuning in. I hope you reviewed or learned a lot. Bye.